In the spring of 1943, a dead man washed ashore on a quiet stretch of Spanish coastline, and with him came secrets that would change the course of the Second World War. He carried letters, love notes, a photograph of a woman who adored him, and classified military documents that no enemy was ever supposed to read. His name, according to the papers chained to his wrist, was Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, a man who had never truly lived. Somewhere deep inside the British intelligence apparatus, two officers were holding their breath, waiting to learn whether the greatest deception of the war had succeeded or collapsed. Adolf Hitler himself would read the intelligence drawn from that drowned officer's briefcase and redirect his armies based on what he found. But the man beneath the uniform had no military record, no rank, no country, only a forgotten name and a death that in someone else's hands became one of history's most extraordinary secrets. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where history is explored one quiet, extraordinary story at a time. If tonight's documentary speaks to you, a like and a subscription would mean a great deal, though only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And if you are so inclined, leave a comment below with where you are in the world and what time it is as you listen. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different cities, different time zones, different beds, are settling into the same story at the same moment. Tonight's question, one worth carrying with you as you listen, is this: could a single forgotten man, someone history never noticed, change the outcome of World War simply by being in the right place at the right time, even in death? Get comfortable now. Let your shoulders drop, dim the lights if you can, and let yourself drift into the story of the entire story of Operation Mincemeat in World War II. Chapter 1: The Problem Nobody Could Solve, Sicily and the Allied Dilemma of 1943. By the early months of 1943, the war in the Mediterranean had begun to turn. Slowly, like the changing of a tide felt long before it is seen, the momentum that had once belonged to the Axis powers was shifting. The desert campaigns that had exhausted so many men across the sands of North Africa were drawing toward their conclusion, and the Allied armies, British, American, and their partners, were pressing forward with a kind of quiet, determined force that the previous years had not always permitted. The British 8th Army had spent months advancing westward from Egypt into Tunisia, following the decisive battles around El Alamein that had broken the German-Italian lines in late 1942. Simultaneously, the Allied First Army, a blend of American and British forces, had swept eastwards from the landings in Algeria and Morocco, landings known as Operation Torch. Together, these two great columns formed a closing pincer around the Axis forces, pressing them back toward the narrow coastal corridor around Bizerti and Tunis. Through March and April of 1943, the fighting was intense and the Axis perimeter shrank further with each passing week. Then, on the 13th of May, it ended. Roughly 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. North Africa was finished. For those gathered around the planning tables in London and Washington, the question that followed was both obvious and deeply uncomfortable. What came next? Sicily presented itself almost immediately as the answer. It sat there in the middle of the Mediterranean, only 90 miles from the North African coast, close enough that one could almost imagine seeing it on a clear day from the right ridge of Tunisian high ground. Winston Churchill had said it plainly to his senior commanders in late 1942. Sicily was an obvious target. It lay at the heart of the Mediterranean, roughly halfway between the Strait of Gibraltar and the Suez Canal. Its deep harbours, its coastal geography, its proximity to the narrow Strait of Messina that separated it from the Italian mainland, everything about its position seemed to call for it. Capturing Sicily would mean eliminating the Axis air and naval bases that had long threatened Allied shipping through the central Mediterranean. It would reopen sea lanes that had been dangerously contested for years. It would provide ports and airfields that the Allies desperately needed as they looked further into Europe. And beyond all of that, it would serve as a springboard, a stepping stone from which an invasion of mainland Italy might be launched, placing enormous pressure on Mussolini's government and forcing Germany to divert divisions away from the Eastern Front, where the Soviet armies had been locked in an almost unbearable struggle for survival. The Soviet Union's leader Joseph Stalin had been pressing hard throughout 1943 for exactly this kind of relief. He had reminded Churchill and Roosevelt of earlier promises to open a second front in the West, and he made no secret of his fear that the Red Army was carrying the full weight of the German war machine alone. A successful thrust through the Mediterranean, one that could knock Italy from the war and compel Germany to spread its forces across a wider front, would answer at least part of that demand, even if it was not the cross-channel invasion Stalin truly wanted. So Sicily made sense. Every strategic instinct pointed toward it, and yet the very clarity of that logic was precisely the problem. If the Allied planners could see that Sicily was the obvious next move, then so could the Germans. And Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief in the Southern Theatre, was not a man who missed obvious moves. He had already concluded by early 1943 that the Allies were preparing a major offensive in the Mediterranean. He understood that the fall of North Africa would free Allied forces and momentum for a new thrust, and he had begun considering where those forces might land. Sicily, lying at the geographic crossroads of the Mediterranean and barely separated from the Italian toe, was no secret to anyone studying a map. On the island itself, the defences were a mixture of quantity and fragility. Roughly 200,000 Italian soldiers were stationed there, organised into coastal divisions and field formations, but most of these were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and suffering from the kind of low morale that comes from years of a war that has not gone well. The more capable defenders were German, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, totalling perhaps 30 to 32,000 men, along with additional Luftwaffe ground personnel. These German units were better trained and more resilient, but they were under strength and could not cover the entire coastline with any genuine density. The defensive line was thin, fragmented, and incapable of mounting a sustained mobile counter-offensive on its own. But Kesselring knew that his strongest defence was not the fortifications on the Sicilian shore. His strongest defence was the island's terrain, its rugged mountains and narrow passes, combined with the simple fact that if the Allies telegraphed their punch, he would have time to reinforce, and that was the heart of the Allied dilemma. A surprise landing could overwhelm those defences before reinforcements arrived. But how does one surprise an enemy who already knows, with a fair degree of certainty, where the blow is coming? The Allied planners recognised this. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had commanded Operation Torch and now directed the Allied Force Headquarters with authority over the entire Mediterranean theatre, understood that the invasion's success would depend not only on logistical preparation and military strength, but on whether the Germans could be made to look the wrong way when the time came. General Harold Alexander, who would command the 15th Army Group and lead the ground forces for what was being called Operation Husky, originally scheduled for July 1943, shared the same concern. The planners projected that a fully reinforced landing on a forewarned Sicily could produce around 100,000 Allied casualties, 30,000 killed or missing, 70,000 wounded. Those were not abstract figures. They were lives, and they hung over every meeting and every memorandum with a quiet, heavy weight. Operation Husky needed Sicily, but Sicily, fully expected and fully defended, was a fearful prospect. The question that began to take shape was not simply how to invade Sicily, it was how to make the enemy believe the invasion was going somewhere else entirely. There were, fortunately, alternatives that might seem plausible to German eyes. Greece, lying on the southern edge of German-controlled Europe, offered a tempting target in Axis strategic imagination. German planners knew that Allied airfields in Greece could threaten the vital Romanian oil fields, disrupt Axis supply routes across the Aegean, and open a path into the Balkans, a region the German High Command was already nervous about holding. Sardinia, lying just off the Italian coast in the Tyrrhenian Sea, was another possibility. Lightly defended and positioned to dominate the sea lanes toward mainland Italy, it too could serve as a plausible stepping stone that a cautious Allied commander might prefer over the more heavily watched Sicilian shore. British intelligence had already demonstrated, in earlier years of the war, that the Germans could be made to believe in false invasion targets. Deception operations run before and during the North African landings had used double agents, dummy radio traffic, and carefully crafted false intelligence to shift German attention away from the true Allied objectives. The 20 Committee, the secret arm of a five body that managed Britain's network of turned German agents, had refined this art to a remarkable degree. Through the double-cross system, false intelligence fed to German handlers had helped mislead the enemy about Allied intentions on multiple occasions. Now, as the spring of 1943 settled across the Mediterranean, and the last Axis troops in Tunisia prepared to lay down their arms, the Allied commanders and their intelligence officers began to ask a question that was both practical and, in its way, quietly extraordinary. Could a deception operation be constructed that was bold enough and convincing enough to pull German eyes away from Sicily entirely? Could the defenders of that island be made to wait somewhere else, waiting for an invasion that was never coming, while the real landings went ashore in the pre-dawn darkness of a July morning? The answer was not obvious. The obstacles were real. The German intelligence services were experienced, cautious, and not easily fooled by shallow theatrics. Any deception would need to be deep. It would need to be layered. It would need to offer the Germans something they could hold, something they could touch, something that would feel irrefutably real. With the strategic dilemma clearly laid out and the cost of failure hanging over every Allied planning table, two unlikely officers from the quieter corners of British intelligence were about to propose a solution so strange it might have seemed impossible, had they not already begun to believe it could work. Chapter 2: The Architects of Deception, Montagu, Cholmondeley, and the Plan That Should Not Have Existed. There are moments in history when two very different minds find themselves seated at the same table, drawn together not by chance, but by the quiet gravity of an extraordinary idea. In the winter of 1942, somewhere within the carefully guarded corridors of wartime London, two such men came to share a purpose. One was a naval intelligence officer and brilliant barrister. The other was a young RAF flight lieutenant quietly embedded within the world of Britain's most secret committees. Together, they would begin to shape one of the most improbable deception operations the world had ever known. Ewen Edward Samuel Montagu was, in almost every sense, a man shaped by institutions. Born in 1901 into an aristocratic Jewish family, he moved through the great chambers of English learning with quiet confidence. Westminster School, then Trinity College at Cambridge, then Harvard University across the Atlantic. He was called to the bar in 1924, and over the following years built a reputation as a lawyer of considerable intelligence and composure, perhaps most notably in his defense of Alma Rattenbury in 1935. By 1939 he had taken silk, the mark of a King's Counsel, a man at the height of his legal powers. But the world was changing. Montagu had joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve as early as 1938, and when war came, the Admiralty recognised something in him that had little to do with courtrooms. His legal mind, precise, analytical, accustomed to constructing arguments that could withstand the harshest scrutiny, made him well suited for a very different kind of work. He was posted to the Naval Intelligence Division, and in time was appointed as the naval representative on the 20 Committee, the secret interagency body at the heart of Britain's double-cross system. The 20 Committee, known also as the XX Committee for its double Roman numerals, had been established in early 1941 within WWII. Its purpose was to oversee and direct what the British called the double-cross system, the careful turning of captured or surrendered German agents into instruments of deliberate misinformation. These men and women, once loyal to the Abwehr, would now serve as conduits for elaborately constructed falsehoods, feeding false intelligence back to Berlin under the watchful guidance of their new British handlers. The committee was chaired by John Cecil Masterman, an Oxford historian who brought to the work a scholar's patience and a strategist's eye. Within the Naval Intelligence Division, Montagu headed a sub-branch designated NYD-17M, overseeing all naval deception operations that involved the double agents and their delicate management. He was methodical, imaginative, and deeply familiar with the fragile architecture of deception, what a lie needed in order to be believed, and equally, what details, if wrong, could cause the entire structure to collapse. Across the table from Montagu, in the world of the 20 Committee, sat a younger and rather different figure. Charles Christopher Cholmondeley had been born in 1917, and by the time of the war had found himself serving as a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force, Volunteer Reserve. He was subsequently seconded to WWII, where he took on the quiet but consequential role of secretary to the 20 Committee, the man who kept the machinery of the double-cross world moving smoothly from meeting to meeting, paper to paper. Cholmondeley was, by many accounts, a man possessed of a vivid and unconventional imagination. It was this imagination that in November of 1942 led him to bring before the committee a proposal that was, at first glance, almost unspeakably strange. He suggested using the body of a dead man to carry fabricated documents into enemy hands, a corpse dressed as a military officer, laden with forged correspondence, set adrift near the shores of a neutral country where German intelligence was known to be active. The committee, confronted with this idea, declined it. The plan in its initial form was not approved, but Masterman, the committee's chairman, saw in the proposal something that should not be entirely abandoned. He recognised that the underlying logic, the possibility of feeding Germany a great strategic lie through a channel they could not easily dismiss, was sound, and so rather than let the idea dissolve, he assigned Montagu to work alongside Cholmondeley, to bring legal rigour and operational experience to bear on what had so far been only a raw and unpolished concept. The partnership that followed was, by its nature, a meeting of complementary strengths. Cholmondeley brought imagination and a willingness to think in ways that more cautious minds might refuse. Montagu brought the analytical discipline of a barrister, the ability to anticipate objections, to construct a narrative so thoroughly consistent that it could survive examination. Between them, they began to give shape to what would eventually become Operation Mincemeat. The idea they were working with was not, in truth, entirely new. It had roots that reached back further than the war itself. In 1939, a document had circulated through the Naval Intelligence Division that had come to be known as the Trout Memo. The memo, issued under the name of Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, used the analogy of fly fishing to describe a series of imaginative methods for deceiving an enemy in wartime. Among its suggestions was a proposal, described in the memo's own words as not a very nice one, to use a dead body carrying false documents as a means of misleading opposing forces. The memo was widely believed to have been written not by Godfrey himself, but by his personal assistant, a young officer named Ian Fleming, who would go on, long after the war's end, to create the character of James Bond. The concept within the Trout memo was itself not original. It had been drawn more or less directly from a 1937 detective novel called The Milliner's Hat Mystery, written by a former intelligence officer named Basil Thompson. The idea had travelled then from fiction into a classified memorandum, and now from that memorandum into the hands of two men who were determined to make it real. And making it real, as Montagu and Cholmondeley quickly understood, was a task of staggering complexity. From the very beginning, they identified the challenges with clarity. They needed a body, a human corpse, obtained without leaving official traces, preserved carefully enough to survive transport and immersion in seawater while still appearing recently dead. They needed to build around that body an entire life, a credible identity, a military history, personal letters, photographs, receipts, religious symbols, the accumulated small details of an existence. And they needed official documents, correspondence of the highest apparent authority, letters from senior military figures suggesting in tone and content that the Allied invasion of southern Europe would fall not on Sicily, but on Greece. The dead man would need a name. They chose to call him Major William Martin, a Royal Marine officer. Around that name they would construct a careful fiction, love letters from a woman he had left behind, a bill from a London tailor, a photograph tucked into a wallet. Every element had to bear scrutiny, because they understood something important about the German intelligence analysts who would ultimately receive this material. The Abwehr and the broader apparatus of German military intelligence relied heavily on human sources in neutral countries. Material recovered in Spain, and Spain was where the plan was to unfold, would be treated as authentic precisely because it arrived through a channel the Germans trusted. They chose Spain deliberately, and within Spain they chose the coast near the port of Huelva. It was a place where the ocean currents could be expected to carry a body to shore. It was a place where German intelligence maintained a significant presence. And it was a place where the Spanish authorities, given the political complexities of the Franco government's relationship with both sides of the war, could be expected to pass along interesting materials through channels that would eventually reach Berlin. The relationship between Britain and Spain in 1943 was not a comfortable one. It was marked by deep suspicion, diplomatic confrontation, and the knowledge that Madrid was a city in which the intelligence operatives of many nations moved quietly alongside one another. British agents remained in Spain on the understanding that they would not act openly against the Franco regime. The Germans, meanwhile, maintained a network of contacts and collaborators that made Spain one of the most active theatres of intelligence exchange in the European war. Montagu and Cholmondeley understood this landscape well, and they understood that the right material discovered in the right place would move swiftly through it toward the desks they needed it to reach. Before any of this could move forward, however, it needed approval from those far above them in the hierarchy of wartime decision-making. The plan required the support of the senior military and civilian leadership, and ultimately the endorsement of the Prime Minister himself. Winston Churchill, briefed on the proposal, reviewed the operation and gave his consent. He is said to have weighed the risks with characteristic directness, quipping even about the possibility of having to retrieve the body should the plan fail, before delegating the final operational confirmation to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, leaving the practical execution to those who had conceived it. There had been skepticism, of course. There were those within British intelligence who questioned the operation's practicality, who doubted that so fragile and elaborate a construction could survive contact with reality. The plan required too many things to go right, in too many places, at exactly the right time. a body that deteriorated too quickly, a Spanish official who looked too carefully, a German analyst who asked too many questions. Any one of these could bring the whole structure down. But Montagu and Cholmondeley pressed forward. They tested the durability of ink in seawater. They studied the specifics of uniform sizing. They made certain that every detail, from the religious symbols on the dead man's person to the precise wording of the forged letters, would survive not only the journey through the sea, but also the forensic attention of professionals trained to find inconsistencies. The broader world in which they worked was itself a world in motion. The Allied victory at Stalingrad had, by early 1943, shifted something fundamental in the momentum of the war. North Africa was drawing toward its conclusion. The next great question was where the Allies would strike next in the Mediterranean, and everyone, on both sides, understood that Sicily was the most obvious answer. The challenge for British intelligence was to make the Germans believe the obvious answer was wrong. Operation Mincemeat was born of that challenge. It was an attempt, framed with extraordinary ingenuity, to redirect the weight of German military attention away from a truth that could not easily be hidden, and toward a fiction carefully constructed to be more compelling than reality itself. The planning began formally in February of 1943, and across the following 10 weeks, the two officers built their operation piece by piece, in the careful, unhurried manner of men who understood that the smallest error could be the most consequential. They were not working quickly, they were working precisely. With the plan approved and the two officers given extraordinary license to pursue it, the next and perhaps most unsettling task lay ahead. Finding not a character to play Major William Martin, but a body. Chapter 3. The Man Who Never Was. Building the identity of Major William Martin. Before a man can vanish into the sea, he must first exist. And so, in the quiet rooms of British naval intelligence, a team of careful minds set about the slow and deliberate work of building a life. Not a life to be lived, but a life to be believed. A life that would hold together under the cold, scrutinizing gaze of enemy analysts half a continent away. The man they were creating had a name: Major William Martin, Acting Major, Royal Marines, attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. The name itself was chosen with care. William, sturdy, traditional, English in the way that old stone churches are English. Martin, common enough among Royal Marines officers of that rank that no one would be expected to know him personally. Common enough to belong to no one in particular, and yet particular enough to belong to someone real. The rank too had been considered at length. A major carried enough seniority to be trusted with sensitive documents. Not so senior that his death would prompt a flood of personal inquiries from those who might have known him closely. He occupied, in the careful mathematics of deception, exactly the right level of importance. The Royal Marines were chosen for another reason as well. As a branch falling under the authority of the Admiralty, any official correspondence regarding Major Martin's fate could be handled quietly, within channels already familiar to the planners of the operation. Even his uniform was practical in its deception. Marine battle dress came in standard sizes and was readily available. The body, once dressed, would be dressed convincingly, but the uniform alone would not be enough. A German intelligence analyst, the planners understood, would not be satisfied with a name and a rank. He would look for texture, for the small imperfections and mundane details that mark a real human life. A man carries the weight of his days in his pockets. He carries receipts and letters and the stubs of tickets from evenings spent in warm theatres. He carries the quiet evidence of a life in motion. And so they built that evidence, one careful piece at a time. There were love letters, 2 of them, written by a young woman in a wartime government office who was asked to lend her voice to a woman who did not exist. The fictitious fiancée was called Pam, and the letters signed in her name were crafted to feel urgent and tender and slightly breathless in the way that wartime correspondence often was. The first letter spoke of the ache of watching a loved one leave at a railway station, the hollow feeling of the hours afterward, the effort of pulling oneself together. The second was shorter, more hurried, written on plain carbon copy paper, apologising for a delayed reply, praising his letters as heavenly, begging for secrecy about a possible posting abroad. Together, the two letters trace the outline of a relationship that felt fragile and precious and very, very real. For a photograph of Pam, the planners turned to a young MI5 secretary named Jean Leslie, who was 18 years old and willing to help. A photograph of her, taken casually, informally, the kind of image a young woman might give to someone she loved, was slipped into the wallet among Martin's personal effects. It was enough. A face, a real face belonging to a real person, tucked into the pocket of a man who had never lived. There was also a letter from a father, written in the formal, slightly pompous style of an Edwardian patriarch, precise language, a note from the family solicitor, the faint air of a man accustomed to conducting his affairs at a careful remove from emotion. It was designed to paint a picture of a respectable upper-middle-class family, the kind of family from which a reliable Royal Marines officer might reasonably have come. There was a letter from Lloyd's Bank, informing Major Martin that he had exceeded his agreed overdraft limit and requesting that he attend to the matter at his earliest convenience. This small, entirely ordinary financial embarrassment was included because real people are in debt. Real people receive letters from banks with careful, measured tones that nonetheless carry the faint edge of warning. An officer with no financial concerns, no minor worries, no small frictions against the everyday world, that would have felt too clean, too constructed. The overdraft made him human. There were theatre ticket stubs, the kind a man tucks into a jacket pocket and forgets to remove. Tangible evidence of an evening spent in London, in the warm light and comfortable noise of a West End performance. There was a receipt for an engagement ring. Each item had been considered not in isolation, but as part of a whole. The planners asked themselves what a German intelligence analyst would think when he looked at the contents of these pockets. They asked what he would find convincing, what he would find natural, what small detail might make him pause, and what pattern of details taken together would lead him gently but firmly toward belief. But behind all of this careful construction lay something far quieter and far more sombre. Major William Martin needed a body. His name had been found not in a military register but in a London mortuary. His real name was Glyndwr Michael. He'd been born on the 29th of March 1907 in Aberbargode, a coal mining town in Monmouthshire, Wales. His father, Thomas Michael, had been a coal miner who took his own life when Glyndwr was 15 years old. His mother died when he was 31. After that, the record of his life grows thin and quiet. Occasional work as a gardener and labourer, then the slow drift into homelessness, into the anonymous margins of London's wartime streets. In January of 1943, he was found in a derelict warehouse near King's Cross, gravely ill. He had eaten bread spread with a phosphide-based rat poison, whether by accident, by desperation, or by intent no one could say with certainty. The compound had reacted with the acid in his stomach to produce phosphine gas, which attacked his liver and flooded his lungs with fluid. He was taken to St Pancras Hospital, and there, on the 28th of January 1943, Glyndwr Michael died. He was 36 years old. It was the coroner, Sir Bentley Purchase, who brought the body to the attention of the intelligence officers overseeing the operation, Ewen Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley. Purchase explained that the small quantity of poison Michael had ingested would not be detectable after the body had spent several days in the sea. He explained too that while the man's poverty and undernourishment meant he did not look much like a field officer, he could pass convincingly as a staff officer. The body had been kept refrigerated at 4 degrees Celsius to slow its deterioration. It needed to be used, Purchase warned, within 3 months. There was another dimension to the medical picture, one that mattered enormously to the success of the deception. The physiological effects of phosphide poisoning on the lungs, the pulmonary edema, the fluid accumulation, the tissue damage, could plausibly mimic the internal findings of a man who had drowned. A forensic examiner looking for the signs of death by drowning would search for certain things: frothy foam at the mouth, fluid in the airways, heavy and over-distended lungs. The fluid already present in Michael's lungs from the poison's effects offered something that might satisfy or at least not contradict those expectations. The distinguished pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury was consulted. His expert guidance on the condition of the body, on what would and would not survive immersion in the sea, and on what a forensic examination might plausibly conclude, was woven into the planning. His involvement gave the medical dimension of the operation a foundation of genuine professional authority. The body was stored under refrigeration, carefully preserved against the slow erosion of time, while the rest of Major Martin's life was assembled around it. In those quiet weeks, the planners of Operation Mincemeat did something that had rarely been attempted in the long history of the wartime deception. They built a human being from the outside in. They gave him a rank and a regiment, a father's letter and a lover's photograph, a bank's gentle reprimand and the worn ticket stubs of a London evening. They gave him a name common enough to belong to no one, and specific enough to belong to someone. They dressed his borrowed body in a uniform that fit the story. And all of it, every letter, every receipt, every small and unremarkable detail, was chosen because real men carry real lives in their pockets. And real lives are never quite perfect. They are full of small debts and affectionate letters and evenings at the theatre and the creased photograph of a woman left behind. Glyndwr Michael had lived a life of quiet difficulty, largely unseen by the world. In death he became someone else entirely, a Royal Marines officer whose manufactured existence would travel far beyond the streets of London, carried by cold ocean currents toward a stretch of southern coastline where, the planners hoped, it would be found and believed. With Major William Martin's identity assembled down to the last theatre stub and love letter, the most delicate phase of the operation was about to begin, getting the dead man to the right stretch of coastline without anyone, allied or enemy, learning what the British had done. Chapter 4: Into the Deep, HMS Seraph and the Mission to Deliver the Dead. Somewhere beneath the cold Atlantic surface, moving silently through the dark water, a British submarine carried a secret that had no name. Not officially, not to most of the men aboard. The vessel was HMS Seraph, a sleek and capable S-class submarine, built by Camel Laird and commissioned into Royal Navy service in the early months of 1942. She had already earned a quiet reputation by the time this particular voyage began. Her record included Atlantic and Mediterranean patrols, periscope reconnaissance of enemy-held coastlines, and the careful, patient work of special operations that left no visible trace in the historical record. Before Operation Torch brought Allied forces onto the shores of North Africa in late 1942, it had been Seraph gliding silently through the Mediterranean, her periscope barely breaking the surface, surveying the beaches where soldiers would later land. She was a vessel accustomed to the weight of secrets. At her command stood Lieutenant Norman Jewell, known to those closest to him as Bill. Born in 1913, Jewell had volunteered for submarine service in 1936 and earned his command qualifications by 1941. He was, by the time of this mission, already a proven officer, steady, discreet, and capable of carrying out orders whose full meaning he might never entirely know. That quality of quiet trust would matter enormously in the days ahead. The cargo that had been brought aboard Seraph was unlike anything the crew had encountered before. A sealed metal canister, heavy and cold to the touch, had been loaded with considerable care. The men were told only that it contained a highly classified instrument, meteorological equipment, or perhaps something optical, and that it was to be handled with the utmost caution. The canister was to be treated as though it held something irreplaceable, something whose value to the war effort could not be overstated. And in a sense, that was entirely true. Among themselves, the sailors joked in the way sailors always do. They called the mysterious container by the various names, nicknames that hinted at the impossible thing they half suspected was inside. Some called it their new shipmate. Others gave it more colourful titles, but none of them, or very nearly none, knew the truth. Inside that sealed container, packed in approximately 21 pounds of dry ice, lay the body of a man. His name had been Glyndwr Michael. He had died in January of 1943, a quiet and largely unrecorded death. In the weeks and then months that followed, his body had been kept carefully preserved. First, it rested in a mortuary refrigerator, maintained at a temperature of just above freezing, cold enough to slow decomposition, but not so cold that the flesh would freeze solid and betray itself upon thawing. That delicate balance had been maintained for roughly 3 months. Then, when the time came, the body was sealed into the metal canister alongside the dry ice. As the dry ice sublimated, it filled the interior of the container with carbon dioxide, creating an oxygen-free environment that would keep the body in a state suitable for the mission ahead. The care taken was extraordinary. Every detail had been considered. Now the canister rested in the darkness of the submarine, and Seraph moved through the water toward the coast of Spain. The destination had been chosen with great deliberateness. The port city of Huelva, situated along Spain's southwestern Atlantic coast, possessed a confluence of qualities that made it nearly ideal for what was planned. Its harbour and river estuary faced the open Atlantic in such a way that a body drifting with the currents could plausibly wash ashore. The kind of thing that happened in wartime when ships were torpedoed and men were lost at sea. The prevailing currents in those waters, driven by the southward moving Canary Current that runs along the western Iberian coast as part of the Great North Atlantic Subtropical Gyre, would carry floating debris and a floating body steadily toward the shoreline. Prevailing winds from the east and west reinforced this tendency, pushing the surface of the water landward. The calculations required to release a body at the right moment in the right position, so that the tides and currents would deliver it to shore within a plausible window of time, were precise and careful. The rule of 12, the rule of 7, the tidal current charts, the flood tide hours, all of it had been worked through, so that the release point and the release time would together guide the body naturally to the beach. But Huelva had another quality that mattered just as much as its geography. The city harboured, beneath its surface of wartime neutrality, a network of German intelligence operatives. Spain was officially neutral in the Second World War, though that neutrality had always been complicated. Francisco Franco's sympathies lay with the Axis powers. He had written to Hitler and met him at Hendaye, offering Spain's entry into the war in exchange for territorial concessions, Gibraltar, French Morocco, colonial gains that Germany never delivered. In the absence of a formal alliance, Spain had nevertheless extended quiet cooperation to the German war effort. U-boats were permitted to refuel in Spanish ports. Tungsten and other strategic materials flowed to Germany. German intelligence agents moved through Spanish cities with considerable freedom operating under the cover of diplomatic arrangements and honorary titles. In Glyndwr itself, one such agent was a man named Adolf Klaus. He worked for the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, and he maintained his operations from an estate at La Rabida, coordinating activities against Allied shipping and serving as a reliable conduit for information flowing between Spain and Berlin. If documents were to be found on a body washed ashore near Glyndwr, Adolf Klaus was precisely the kind of man who would ensure those documents reach German eyes quickly. That knowledge had been factored into every calculation behind the mission. On the night of the 30th of April, moving into the first hours of the 1st of May, 1943, HMS Seraph surfaced quietly in the darkness off the Spanish coast. The waters were still. The night sky over the Atlantic offered little light. Lieutenant Jewell came to the deck with his officers. The canister was brought up. The dry ice was releasing its cold vapour into the night air as the seal was broken, and the body, dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marine officer, carrying a briefcase chained to his wrist, fitted with a military life preserver around his torso, was carefully lowered into the sea. It was approximately 10:30 in the evening. The body entered the water quietly, without ceremony, though Jewell is said to have offered a brief and impromptu moment of respect before it slipped beneath the surface. The life preserver kept it afloat. The currents, as the planners had intended, would do the rest. Seraph then transmitted her signal back toward London. The message was brief and composed. It read simply, "Mincemeat, successful." The Admiralty's reply came back without delay. "Well done. Keep on." In the days that followed, the body drifted. The Atlantic currents carried it gently toward the Spanish coast, just as the tidal calculations had anticipated. When it came ashore, it was discovered, and the Spanish naval authorities took charge of the matter, with the formality such a fine demanded. Lieutenant Colonel Ildefonso Gomez Boira, a senior officer within the Spanish naval establishment, oversaw the official handling, the identification procedures, the careful management of the body and its accompanying materials. An autopsy was conducted, as protocol required, but it was what accompanied the body that mattered most: the briefcase, the documents inside, and almost immediately, within hours of the body's discovery, by some accounts, Spanish officials had passed news of the documents to their German contacts. Adolf Klaus received word at Glyndwr. The chain of communication that followed moved swiftly, carrying the contents of those letters upward through the German intelligence apparatus toward Berlin. The British consul in Glyndwr, a man named Francis Haselden, learned that the body had come ashore and was being processed by Spanish authorities. He sent coded messages back to London, messages that travelled through channels the British could monitor, confirming that the body had been received, that the briefcase had been retained, and that communications with German contacts were underway. The deception had made landfall. Glyndwr Michael, who had died alone and largely unnoticed in January, had now washed ashore on a foreign coast wearing another man's name and another man's rank, carrying letters whose contents could alter the course of a war. The sailors of HMS Seraph, who had joked quietly in the darkness about their mysterious canister and their unnamed shipmate, knew only that their signal had been acknowledged. The mission was complete. The body was in the water and the currents had taken him, but now came the longest and most agonizing phase of the operation, waiting in silence, thousands of miles away in London, for any whisper of evidence that the deception was either succeeding or unravelling. Chapter 5: The Waiting Game, Bletchley Park Enigma, and the moment Germany believed the lie. Somewhere in the English countryside, behind fences and beneath the canopy of old trees, a sprawling Victorian estate held a secret that most of the world would not learn for another 3 decades. Bletchley Park, a place of quiet urgency, of long corridors and wooden huts where the war was being fought not with rifles and artillery, but with pencils, punch cards, and the slow turning of mechanical wheels. In those huts, row after row of men and women worked through the night, and through the day, and through the night again. Mathematicians sat beside linguists. Young women from universities bent over long sheets of paper covered in letters that meant nothing, until slowly, patiently they began to mean everything. At its height, nearly 10,000 people laboured at Bletchley Park, and roughly 3/4 of them were women, a fact that the official histories would overlook for many years. At the heart of their work was the Enigma machine, a compact, unremarkable-looking device, its origins traced back to a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius, who had devised it after the First World War. The machine used interchangeable rotors, a reflector, and a plug board to transform each letter typed into a completely different letter, and then into another and another, with every keystroke shifting the internal configuration. The result was a cipher so complex, so layered, that Germany's military believed it could never be broken. Not in any reasonable span of time, not by any human effort. They were not entirely wrong about the difficulty, but they were wrong about the impossibility. The first cracks had come from Poland. Before the war, Polish cryptanalysts had quietly reconstructed the wiring of the Enigma machine, developed early tools to test possible settings, and gathered mathematical insights that most of Europe had not yet considered. In July of 1939, just weeks before the German invasion of Poland, they shared everything with British intelligence. It was an act of extraordinary generosity in the shadow of catastrophe, and it gave Bletchley Park the foundation it needed. From that foundation, figures like Alan Turing built something remarkable. Turing led the effort against naval Enigma, developing electromechanical machines known as bombs, devices that could test thousands of rotor configurations in the time it would have taken a human team days or weeks to explore. Gordon Welshman refined those bombs, improving their efficiency in ways that multiplied their power considerably. Hugh Alexander directed the cryptanalysis of Army and Air Force Enigma traffic from Hut 6. Joan Clark worked alongside Turing in the naval effort. Mavis Beatty had already demonstrated what a single break in the cipher could accomplish, having contributed intelligence that helped secure a decisive naval victory at Cape Matapan. John Tiltman worked across multiple cipher systems. Bill Tutter unravelled the structure of the Lorenz cipher through sheer statistical reasoning, opening another door entirely. And all the while the intercepted signals flowed in from listening stations scattered across Britain, arriving at Bletchley by motorcycle, by teleprinter, by radio, where operators logged them and passed them along through a careful system of compartments. Each hut knew only what it needed to know. The secrecy was layered and methodical, enforced by the Official Secrets Act and by a culture of absolute discretion that held firm for decades after the war. The intelligence produced from all of this was given a name: Ultra. From the middle of 1941, Ultra became the quiet thread running through nearly every major Allied decision. When reports were shared with commanders in the field, they were attributed to a fictitious spy network called Boniface, so that no one outside a small circle would suspect that German ciphers had been compromised. Commanders who received Ultra intelligence could act on it, but they could never acknowledge where it had come from. Ultra had already shaped the Battle of Britain, the struggle in North Africa, the long contest of the Atlantic. Churchill spoke of it with reverence. Eisenhower would later say it was decisive. The military historian Sir Harry Hinsley, who had worked at Bletchley himself, believed it shortened the war by years. It was into this world of patient listening and careful reading that the question of Operation Mincemeat now arrived. Somewhere in the warm shallows off the Spanish coast, a briefcase had washed ashore with a body. The documents inside had passed from Spanish authorities to German hands, been examined, photographed, assessed, and quietly returned. Now, weeks later, Bletchley Park was listening. The intercepted signals began to arrive, and what they contained was exactly what the planners in London had hoped for, though perhaps more than any of them had dared to fully expect. A German telegram had been intercepted in which Adolf Hitler himself addressed the contents of what had been recovered from the body of the man the British had called Major Martin. Hitler's assessment was direct. The documents were authentic. The Anglo-Saxon order recovered from the briefcase confirmed what he believed. The Allies were preparing their main thrust not against Sicily, but against Sardinia and the Peloponnese, against Greece, against the Balkans. Hitler ordered the 1st Panzer Division transferred from France to Salonika. He ordered troops in Sardinia to be doubled. He directed fighter aircraft to be repositioned. He sent additional torpedo units. He laid 3 new minefields off the Greek coast. The weight of German military planning, which had been poised to concentrate on the defence of Sicily, began to shift. The examination of the documents had been carried out within the German intelligence structure by the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. The Abwehr's liaison officer in Madrid, Lieutenant Colonel Fritz Böhm, had evaluated the papers and reached a conclusion that aligned with what the documents were designed to suggest. The Allies were planning an invasion of Greece. That assessment moved up the chain. The analysts expressed confidence in the authenticity of the materials. Whatever scrutiny had been applied, the deception had passed through it undisturbed. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the long-serving head of the Abwehr, oversaw an organisation that had accepted the planted materials as genuine. There is no evidence that Canaris himself personally examined the documents. The evaluation had been carried out by subordinates, passed upward, and accepted. The machinery of German intelligence had processed the lie and returned a verdict of truth. In Madrid, the Spanish naval authorities had played their part with a careful kind of studied neutrality. The documents had moved through their system in what was presented as routine handling of neutral country paperwork. The German naval attaché and other officials had been permitted to consult the relevant files through standard diplomatic channels. Copies had been made, the originals had been returned. All of it had been conducted with the outward appearance of administrative propriety. In London, British intelligence was watching closely. The documents had been returned to the British naval attaché in Madrid, referred to in the intelligence correspondence simply by the designation NA. When the materials came back, they were subjected to careful examination. The envelopes, the seals, the condition of the paper. Techniques of microscopic analysis, optical and otherwise, were brought to bear on the question of whether the materials had been opened and resealed. The evidence that came back was quietly conclusive in its own way. The documents had been accessed. Germany had seen what it was meant to see, and then, in a coded telegram that arrived for Ewen Montagu, one of the principal architects of the operation, the confirmation came through with a directness that left little room for doubt. The message read simply, "Mincemeat successful." The Germans had reinforced Greece and Sardinia. The words were spare, almost understated, as if the magnitude of what they described required no elaboration. Across the Mediterranean, the effects were becoming visible in the intelligence picture that Ultra continued to assemble. The number of German divisions in the Balkans and Greece was rising sharply, climbing from around 8 to something closer to 18. The 1st Panzer Division had moved. The 1st Mountain Division had been positioned under the newly reorganised Army Group E. On the 23rd of July 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself was transferred to Greece and appointed commander of that formation, tasked with defending the Balkans against an Allied invasion that was, in fact, never coming to those shores. He was recalled to Berlin only days later after events in Italy intervened, but his very presence in Greece spoke to how deeply the deception had penetrated German strategic thinking. Minefields had been laid in Greek waters. Naval assets, including minesweepers and mine-laying equipment, had been pulled away from Sicily and redirected towards Sardinia. The island that the Allies were actually going to invade had been left by comparison thinly defended. The Italian forces on Sicily, who had drawn their own conclusions about Allied intentions, believed they were witnessing the opening act of a campaign designed to drive Italy out of the war entirely. They were not wrong about that broader goal, but they were operating without the full picture of how completely German strategic attention had been redirected elsewhere. At Bletchley Park, the work continued. The bombs turned. The paper accumulated. The signals flowed in, and the analysts bent over them, and the intelligence moved quietly upward to the people who needed it. No one outside that circle knew what was being read or how or by whom. The war, in that sense, was being fought in two registers simultaneously, one loud and violent and visible, the other almost entirely silent. The deception had taken root in the very soil of German high command. It had moved through Hitler's own reasoning and emerged as strategic fact. The reinforcements were real, the minefields were real, the redeployment of Rommel was real. All of it had flowed from a set of forged letters tucked into a briefcase, attached to the wrist of a man who had never lived. With Germany's armies and attention turned toward Greece and Sardinia, the stage was set for the real assault. And now the question was no longer whether the deception had worked, but how deeply the lie had taken root in enemy soil. Chapter 6. Operation Husky, the Aftermath, and the Forgotten Man Who Changed the War. In the deep, still hours before dawn on the 10th of July, 1943, the Mediterranean Sea carried an armada unlike anything the ancient waters had ever known. Thousands of ships moved quietly through the darkness, their hulls low against the waves, their decks heavy with soldiers who waited in silence for the shore to appear. The island of Sicily lay ahead, a darkened mass of hills and coastline, and the war was about to arrive upon it. Operation Husky had begun. The objectives were clear, though the task was immense. The Allies sought to seize Sicily entirely, to open the Mediterranean shipping lanes, to force Germany to pull its soldiers away from the Eastern Front, to strike at Italy's willingness to continue fighting, and to establish a platform from which the long road into mainland Europe could begin. Beneath all of those ambitions lay something simpler and more immediate: the need to land safely on a fortified shore without suffering catastrophic losses. The forces assembled for this purpose were vast and varied. General Sir Harold Alexander commanded the 15th Army Group, with General Dwight D. Eisenhower serving as Supreme Allied Commander, and Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham overseeing the naval operations. The American 7th Army landed along the southwestern beaches, its infantry divisions moving in close formation through rough surf and uncertain terrain. The British 8th Army came ashore along the southeastern coast, its ranks drawn from Scottish Highlanders, Northumbrian veterans, and Canadian soldiers who had crossed an ocean to fight on this distant island. Above them, the 82nd Airborne had already descended through the darkness. Parachutists and glider troops scattered by strong winds across the Sicilian countryside, yet still managing to sow confusion deep behind the Axis lines. The Axis defences they encountered, though numerous in number, were far weaker than they might have been. Sicily had been held primarily by Italian forces, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 soldiers, whose morale and equipment left much to be desired. The German component was far smaller, roughly 30,000 troops, composed mainly of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. But even that German presence had been reduced by the months of careful deception that had preceded the landings. Field Marshal Kesselring had shifted a portion of the 15th Panzergrenadier to the western coast of Sicily, drawn there by intelligence he believed to be genuine, intelligence that had arrived in part inside the briefcase of a man who had never existed. The broader deception program, of which Operation Mincemeat was only one thread, had worked with quiet, devastating effectiveness. Under the wider plan known as Operation Barclay, false concentrations of troops, dummy landing craft, and fabricated radio traffic had suggested to German planners that the real Allied blow would fall upon the Balkans, upon Greece, upon Sardinia, anywhere but the island now being stormed in the July darkness. Panzer divisions had been redirected. German naval vessels had been pulled from Sicilian waters. Erwin Rommel himself had been redeployed to Greece to command forces there. The forces that had gathered to defend this island against a blow that everyone feared was never quite large enough to stop the blow that actually came. Without the deception historians have calculated, the German strength on Sicily could have reached as many as 70,000 soldiers, more than double what was actually present. Additional divisions from France and the Eastern Front might have been waiting in reserve. The coastline might have been far more heavily reinforced. The landings, already dangerous, might have become something far darker. Instead, the Allied forces moved ashore with relative speed, and the Axis counterattacks, swift and determined as they were, ultimately could not hold. The German commanders responded with characteristic urgency. Kesselring directed the Hermann Göring Division and the 15th Panzergrenadier to launch armoured counterattacks against the American positions at Gela and the British positions further along the coast. For a brief and anxious period, the beachheads were under serious pressure. German tanks rolled toward the sea, but Allied air superiority, naval gunfire, and the determined resistance of the infantry held the line. The counterattacks faltered. The advance resumed. Over the weeks that followed, the campaign moved with a pace that surprised even those who had planned it. City after city fell. Palermo was taken. Syracuse was secured. The Allied armies pressed northward and eastward, squeezing the remaining Axis forces toward the narrow strait at Messina. By the 17th of August 1943, roughly 5 weeks after the first soldier had stepped onto the beach, the campaign was over. Messina was in Allied hands. Sicily belonged to the Allies. The human cost of those 5 weeks was measured in tens of thousands of lives. Allied forces suffered approximately 30,000 casualties in total, British, American, Canadian, naval, and air crew alike. It was a heavy toll carried by real men with real families, and it should not be passed over lightly. Yet historians who have studied the operation in depth have noted, with quiet gravity, that the original Allied planners had projected losses in the range of 40,000 to 50,000. The deception operations, of which mincemeat was a central celebrated element, had likely reduced the actual toll by somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 lives. Those are numbers that resist easy comprehension. But somewhere behind each one is a soldier who came home, a family that remained whole, a letter that was never written. The fall of Sicily carried consequences far beyond the island itself. On the 25th of July 1943, barely a week after the campaign reached its decisive phase, Benito Mussolini was removed from power by the fascist Grand Council, arrested by order of the king, and replaced by Marshal Pietro Badoglio. Italy's military disaster in Sicily had shattered the last illusions about Mussolini's leadership. The new government opened secret negotiations with the Allies almost immediately. Within weeks, the nation that had stood beside Germany since the beginning was quietly preparing to step away. Germany was now fighting alone in the Mediterranean, and the burden of defending the Italian peninsula the Balkans, and the islands of the sea fell entirely on German shoulders. Divisions that might have been sent to strengthen the Eastern Front were redirected southward instead. Airfields in Sicily and later southern Italy gave Allied bombers new reach over the continent, bringing Romanian oil fields and German industrial targets within range for the first time. The island that had once been a distant objective on a planning map had become, in the space of 5 weeks, one of the great strategic hinges of the war. In later years, scholars would debate precisely how much of this had depended on Operation Mincemeat and how much on the broader currents of the conflict. Some historians, like Michael Howard, suggested that Hitler's pre-existing anxieties about the Balkans had made him predisposed to believe the false documents, that the deception had worked, in part, because it confirmed what he already feared. Others stressed the cumulative weight of the full deception program, Operation Barclay, and argued that Mincemeat was one voice in a larger chorus. Ben McIntyre, who studied the operation in careful detail after the full files were opened, concluded that the precise contribution could not be calculated with certainty, only that it had mattered, and mattered significantly. The files themselves had remained sealed for decades. In 1953, Ewen Montagu had written his account of the operation, The Man Who Never Was, completed, by some accounts, over a single weekend, driven partly by the need to correct a fictional novel that had borrowed a similar premise. The book became an immediate bestseller. The 1956 film that followed, starring Clifton Webb, earned a BAFTA and brought the story to audiences far beyond the reading public. But Montagu's account, vivid and compelling as it was, had been constrained by what was still classified. The role of ultra-intelligence in confirming the German reaction went unmentioned. The broader structure of Operation Barclay was absent, and the true identity of the man at the centre of the story, the body that had made all of it possible, remained hidden. It was not until 1997 that the complete Operation Mincemeat files were released, and it was not until 1998 that the British government officially confirmed and publicly announced what those files had long suggested, that the man carried aboard HMS Seraph, dressed in a borrowed uniform and bearing a fabricated identity, had been a Welsh drifter named Glyndwr Michael. He had been born in 1909, the son of a coal hauler named Thomas and a woman named Sarah Ann. His family had been desperately poor, driven at one point to the workhouse, though they left the very next day. His father died in 1925, his mother died in 1940. By the time he came to the attention of the intelligence services, he was already a man without anchor, living in warehouses, surviving without employment or family, adrift in a city that had not noticed him. When he died, no one came forward to claim him. There were no close relatives remaining, no friends who knew where he had gone. He was, in the most literal sense, unclaimed by the world. Modern scholars have returned to that fact with something more than historical curiosity. The use of his body, without consent, without the knowledge of any family, without any record of consultation, raises questions that belong not only to history but to ethics. He had been a vulnerable man marginalised by poverty and circumstance, invisible to the institutions of the society around him. And in death, that invisibility had made him useful in ways that his life never could. Historians and ethicists have noted, with quiet honesty, that contemporary standards of dignity and informed consent would not have permitted what was done, however great the purpose it served. His name was placed on a memorial plaque in Aberbargode in South Wales, the town connected to his story, inscribed in Welsh with words that translate simply as "the man who never was." It is a small memorial for a large absence. The men who planned the operation went on to live long and largely ordinary lives. Ewen Montagu returned to law. served with distinction on the bench, and remained a public figure until his death in 1985. Charles Cholmondeley left Memphbois 5 in 1952, moved to the West Country, ran a horticultural business, married and raised children, speaking almost nothing of his wartime work until the end. He died in 1982, and it was Montagu who wrote his obituary for the Times. Lieutenant Norman Jewell, who had commanded the submarine that carried the body to Spanish waters, went on to a long naval career before retiring to civilian life. He lived until 2004, dying at 90, one of the last living threads connecting the present to that cold April morning off the Spanish coast. Operation Mincemeat has since been recognised in military curricula, commemorated at the Imperial War Museum, and retold in a West End musical that carried the story all the way to Broadway. The blue plaque in London marks the house where the plan took shape. The Royal British Legion has used the story in its remembrance observances. The operation has become, in the decades since the war, a kind of legend, taught, debated, filmed, sung and studied. And yet the legend rests at its foundation on the life of a man who lived without recognition and died without ceremony. A man for whom no grand strategy was planned, no legacy was designed. A man who simply was, briefly, quietly, invisibly, and whose last unknowing service to the world was the gift of his presence in the water off a Spanish shore. And so the story of Operation Mincemeat comes to rest not on a battlefield or in a command room, but at a quiet grave in a Spanish cemetery, where a man the world forgot was buried under a name he never owned, yet whose brief invented life may have saved thousands of real ones.